Few events loom larger in the history of the apartheid regime than those of the afternoon of March 21, 1960, in Sharpeville, South Africa. Throughout the 1950s, South African blacks intensified their resistance against the oppressive apartheid system. Sharpeville, home to 26,000 blacks within the larger town of Vereeniging, located south of Johannesburg, seemed an unlikely setting for a watershed moment in the history of apartheid resistance. Before the massacre, white officials considered Sharpeville a small, insignificant, and even a model black township. However, the events of March 21, 1960, in this small, insignificant black town could be a turning point for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Welcome to today's video, where we will go into one of the bloodiest massacres of the apartheid regime in colonized South Africa. Before we delve into the events of the Sharpeville massacre, let us first understand the context of apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was a system of racial segregation enforced by the government of South Africa from 1948 to 1994. This system institutionalized discrimination against non-white citizens of South Africa, denying them basic human rights, such as the right to vote, own property, or even travel freely. In the 1950s, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was gaining momentum, with many people calling for an end to the discriminatory policies of the government. For a century and a half, blacks in the Union of South Africa have had to carry passbooks. But it is only in recent years of the 1950s, under the Boer regime of Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, that the passbook became a physical shackle. The pass lists the African's name, birthplace, and tribal affiliation, contains his picture and serial number, has space for a receipt to prove that he has paid his taxes and to list his arrests, and unless it is signed each month by his employer, the African can be herded with the other unemployed into a native reservation. If an African travels from the countryside to the city or just across the street for cigarettes, South Africa's hard-fisted police must check his pass. If he stands outside his front door without his pass, the police will not let him walk 5 feet to get it. He will be hauled off to jail without notice to his employer or family and fined or imprisoned. Murders go unsolved while the courts were jammed with past offenders. For years, the Africans hated and endured the system. Then a new and more militant organization called the Pan-African Congress decided to exploit the passbook grievance. It urged Africans all over the Union to descend upon local police stations, without their passbooks, without arms, without violence, and demand to be arrested. In a few spots, the turnout was impressive. At Orlando Township in the outskirts of Johannesburg, 20,000 Africans milled around the police station, led by Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, a Methodist-reared university instructor who heads the Pan-African Congress. 15 miles to the south in Everton, 70,000 Africans turned out. The nervous police made few arrests of the demonstrators. However, at Langa near Cape Town, they opened fire to disperse the Africans, killing 3 and wounding 25. At first, everything was relatively quiet, even at the Sharpeville police station, 28 miles southwest of Johannesburg. However, Sharpeville soon became the headliner of the horror that was to come. 20 police, nervously eyeing a growing mob of 20,000 Africans demanding to be arrested, barricaded themselves behind a 4-foot wire mesh fence surrounding the police station. The crowd's mood was ugly, and 130 police reinforcements, supported by 4 Saracen armored cars, were rushed in. Sabre jets and Harvard trainers zoomed within 100 feet of the ground, buzzing the crowd in an attempt to scatter it. The Africans responded by hurling stones, which rattled harmlessly off the armored cars and into the police compound, striking 3 policemen. A few hours later, the blow-up came. When police tried to seize an African at the gate to the compound, there was a scuffle, and the crowd advanced toward the fence. Police Commander G.D. Pinar gave out an order to his men to load. Within minutes, almost in a chain reaction, the police began firing with revolvers, rifles, and Sten guns. A woman shopper patronizing a fruit stand at the edge of the crowd was shot dead. A 10-year-old boy fell as well. Crazily, the unarmed crowd stampeded to safety as more shots rang out, leaving behind hundreds lying dead or wounded, many of them shot in the back. It was all over in 2 awful minutes. As the police emerged to clean up the carnage, one officer grew sick at the sight and vomited. But the police commander claimed that the protesters had struck his car with a stone, and they must learn their lesson if they want to commit such acts. The official estimates of the deaths were pegged at 69. However, there are other reports that gave estimates ranging from 72 to 90. The dead were carted off to makeshift morgues. About 200 wounded overflowed the native hospital. And so much plasma was needed that African blood gave out, and the wounded got transfusions from reserve white stocks. All of South Africa was stunned by the sudden bloodshed that had always been implicit in Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd's unrelenting policies. The English-language Johannesburg Star rebuked the government's pathetic faith in the power of machine guns to settle basic human problems, and the Anglican Bishop of Johannesburg appealed to all those in South Africa who have any human feelings to stop the police tactics. More than 500 white students at the University of Natal, carrying banners reading Hitler 1939, Verwoerd 1960, assembled on campus to lower the British and South African flags to half-mast. But in the rest of Africa and throughout the world, the reaction was even angrier. Liberia's President William Tubman called the Sharpeville massacre the vilest, most reckless and unconscionable action in history. In London, a crowd shouting "murder" had to be dispersed from South Africa House under an ordinance that prohibits any public gathering within a mile of Parliament when the House of Commons is in session. In Vatican City, L'Osservatore Romano demanded to know why South Africa's police did not employ such modern means as water hoses and tear gas, which are in use in all civilized countries, instead of mowing down men, women, and children indiscriminately. Nowhere in the world did a single government side with South Africa. In the United States, the events in Sharpeville made South African policy a priority for a short period. Crucially, the 1960 massacre fomented a connection between the developing civil rights movement in the U.S. and the plight of Black South Africans. Previously, many mainstream civil rights leaders tended to regard the struggle against segregation in the U.S. and the anti-apartheid campaign as separate issues, uncomfortable with addressing the complexities of nationalist liberation movements in Africa. Pressure from U.S. and international organizations helped influence a shift in U.S. policy toward Africa, which became more sympathetic toward liberation movements under President John F. Kennedy. The international community was also outraged by the Sharpeville massacre, and it marked a turning point in the international campaign against apartheid. The international community could no longer ignore the encroachment of the apartheid regime on the freedoms of South Africa's black population, sparking various anti-apartheid campaigns around the world. Boycott movements attempted to weaken the regime economically, a strategy that would become central to the divestment campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s. The International Olympic Committee banned South Africa from the Olympics beginning in 1964, and similar bans prohibited segregated South African teams from participating in international rugby and cricket competitions. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution condemning the massacre and calling for the release of political prisoners in South Africa. Even South Africa's rabidly nationalistic Afrikaans press was having second thoughts. The day before the riots, the Johannesburg Vaderland called for a simpler and less hurtful pass system. The influential Cape Town Die Burger urged moderation on Prime Minister Verwoerd, but Verwoerd obstinately said that nothing would be done to abolish the pass laws and claimed that the demonstrators at Sharpeville had shot first, even though no one found arms on the Africans. Afraid of civil war and preparing for a showdown, the government declared a state of emergency, and thousands of people were arrested. They also canceled all leaves for the 20,000 members of the South African police and placed the members of auxiliary white defense forces on a standby alert. Indoor or outdoor meetings of more than 12 persons were declared illegal. African political organizations were outlawed. Robert Sobukwe and 11 of his Pan-African aides surrendered and were jailed. Albert Luthuli, leader of the more moderate African National Congress, was already under house arrest. As the police emerged to clean up the carnage, both organizations proclaimed a day of mourning for the dead. The police would later release the bodies a few at a time so that there could be no mass funeral, thereby preventing gatherings of people. A work boycott by Africans was ordered, and strong-arm squads called the Spoilers walked the streets to keep Africans off the job. Cape Town docks loading 20 ships were crippled by a walkout of stevedores. On the Johannesburg exchange, gold stocks fell for a paper loss of $250 million in 4 days. Throngs of white South Africans fearing disaster lined up for emigration data at the information offices of Canada and Australia. At week's end came the first giving of ground. South Africa's Commissioner of Police announced that to relieve the tremendous tension, police would no longer ask Africans to show or arrest them for failure to carry the hated passbooks. It represented the first major retreat by the government since the nationalists won power at the polls in 1948. But just when everyone was about to credit Verwoerd's administration with coming to its senses, Defense Minister Francois Erasmus said that the police decision was strictly temporary until the situation quieted. This meant South Africa's course was still set for disaster. The Sharpeville massacre would go on to galvanize the anti-apartheid movement within South Africa. The PC split into different factions, with some pursuing armed struggle and others focusing on non-violent resistance. The ANC and its leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were deeply affected by the Sharpeville massacre. They had been committed to non-violent resistance, but the massacre made them realize that peaceful protest alone could not bring about change in South Africa. After the Sharpeville massacre, the ANC formed a military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation, and abbreviated as MK, which was tasked with carrying out acts of sabotage against government installations and symbols of apartheid. Nelson Mandela, who had been a prominent leader of the ANC, became the commander-in-chief of Umkhonto we Sizwe. But the sabotage campaign was not without its risks. MK operatives faced the constant threat of arrest, imprisonment, and even death. Many were forced to go into hiding or flee the country, often living in difficult conditions for years on end. One of the most significant moments in the history of MK was the Rivonia trial of 1963-64, in which Mandela and other leaders of the ANC were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Mandela famously stated in court that he was prepared to die for the cause of freedom, and he and his co-accused were ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite the risks, MK continued its sabotage campaign throughout the 1970s and 1980s, even as the apartheid regime became increasingly repressive. The campaign played a key role in drawing attention to the struggle for freedom in South Africa and putting pressure on the government to negotiate a peaceful transition to democracy. One of the most famous acts of sabotage during this period was the bombing of the Sasol oil refinery in 1980. The attack caused significant damage to the refinery and sent shockwaves through the government and business community. But it was not just the sabotage campaign that was effective. MK also played a key role in the armed struggle against the South African Defence Force, SADF, in neighboring countries such as Angola and Mozambique. This included the famous Battle of Quito Cuanavale in 1987-88, in which MK and Cuban forces defeated the SADF in a major battle. Ultimately, it was a combination of factors that led to the end of apartheid in South Africa, including international pressure, economic sanctions, and internal resistance. But there can be no doubt that MK played a significant role in this struggle, both through its sabotage campaign and its armed resistance. The Sharpeville massacre was a tragic event that had far-reaching consequences for South Africa and the world. It marked a turning point in the struggle against apartheid and brought international attention to the issue and increased pressure on the South African government to change its policies. It also inspired a generation of activists who would go on to play a crucial role in the eventual overthrow of apartheid. While the aftermath of the massacre was brutal and violent, it also had a positive impact on the struggle for freedom and equality in South Africa, and it serves as a reminder of the power of peaceful resistance in the face of oppression. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like and subscribe.